G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Most parents want their kids to learn how to be good with money because they instinctively know that a failure to learn how to play the game of money will put their kids at a major disadvantage, making their lives so much harder. But whilst the majority of parents want to help their kids, most just don't know how the hell to go about it. Because this is such a hot topic with most parents, I decided to do a 3-part series on kids and money, which I've called Money Muscles. In the first and second parts, I was joined by lawyer and dad Tim Rivett, and we discussed why teaching kids about money is so important and how we are approaching the task with our nieces, nephews, and our daughters, who are all below the age of 12. In this episode, I'll be discussing with Carmen Quade, who's a farmer, an educator, and the mother of 5 kids, how to prepare teenagers and adult children with the money muscles needed to set them up for success. Now, if you haven't listened to the first 2 parts, I recommend you get far more value if you went back to part 1 and 2 first. Now, this is a new format and I'd welcome any feedback and questions. If you love the concept, let us know and we might just do some more. So without further delay, let's get cracking. Welcome, Carmen.
Hello, Ben.
Now, Carmen, when we chatted recently about doing this episode, I was really interested in the fact of, not only your background, but the fact that you've also got 5 kids. And I thought with me having 1 child and my ideas on teaching kids about money, you having 5, I'm guessing you'll have 5 times the experience that I've got. So I'm really interested to hear that perspective. But can we start and can you just give us a bit of a quick rundown on your background, please?
Yeah, certainly, Ben. So I live in Toowoomba now in the middle of New South Wales, so we're a couple of hours north of Wagga. But I actually grew up in Sydney and had an interest, I think, in farming from the beginning, sparked by some cousins who had a hobby farm and some horses and some different things. And I went to uni in Orange at Orange Agricultural College, which is in the University of Sydney, to do agribusiness, and worked a few years and travelled around a bit and met my husband, Anthony, who's, family farms here at Toowoomba. And I went on to study accounting at university. So I did a master's at uni whilst I was a maternity leave project, Ben. These naive people that have babies for the first time thinking that they'll have all this spare time on their hands.
High achievers.
Yeah, which led me into university lecturing in agribusiness and accounting, which I really, really loved. And I've gone on from there to start my own agribusiness training company called AgriFocused, where we do online training and face-to-face business training for farmers and predominantly family farmers. So I run that, and we have our own cropping business here in Toowoomba with a few sheep, which we love.
Excellent. Now, you also 5 children. What ages are they, Carmen?
So they range from 14 down to 4. So we've got the full range at the moment, preschoolers, primary school age kids and a couple of high school kids. So it's certainly, I think it feels like peak hour at the moment, Ben. I think one thing that having 5 kids teaches you is that you don't know anything about raising children because everyone comes along a little bit different than the one before. So it's certainly been a journey, I think, a real journey of self-discovery.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm really passionate about is this financial education for kids. So I've got my 5 little case studies and we'll see how they all turn out, I think, in terms of their financial literacy.
So I know you talked about your background, but why are you passionate about or why are you focused on making sure your kids have a good financial education?
Well, because everything I leave to them's got to be divided 5 ways, Ben. So there's a lot less to go around. So we've got to be really sharp, I think, with a couple of things, and that's building wealth as a family ourselves and meeting our day-to-day expenses for education, for lifestyle, for all of those wonderful things. And also just giving them those skills to make their own way in the world, because I think that's going to be really important for all of us, but particularly for them. So I grew up, as I said, in Sydney, and my family especially my father's family, all small business people. They came from Malta in the late 50s and, established new lives for themselves here in this country. And I think it was always sort of put upon us that we had a real responsibility to work hard and set ourselves up. And that's been something I think my siblings and my cousins and I have really achieved. And it's sort of really important for my husband and I to sort of pass that down onto the next generation.
And so with the training company or the organisation you've set up to do that, you would see a fair number of people that had come to you that haven't been taught those I don't want to say basic skills, but haven't got very strong financial literacy, would you?
Look, I think it's really interesting. The people that are really attracted to farming are really attracted to the outside parts of farming. So they
On
might,
farm.
yeah, so they're passionate about their livestock. They've been driving tractors since they were 8 or 9. They really love their machinery or their cropping or whatever it is they love. That's what draws them to it. People don't go into agriculture because they think, oh, I really like filling in forms and analysing financial information and that side of the business. Now, for lots of reasons, parents tend to focus teaching their skills, those outside skills, changing tyres and, marking lambs and moving calves and all of that sort of thing, perhaps not so much on that finance side. So the people that tend to come to me for a little bit of help are those early management career farmers. So the ages vary, but they're the ones that have sort of perhaps newly taken on that responsibility for the financial management of their farm businesses. Or they're people that have married into the farm business, perhaps more like myself, who then, for lots of reasons, have taken over that side of the business. So they might have their husband out doing the physical work and they might be in the office running that side of the business. So, yes, people vary with the skills that they bring or the knowledge that they bring, but I really think it's very achievable, very easy to learn. Certainly for me, a lot easier to learn than the complexities of reprogramming GPS tractors and what you do when the bearings fall out and all of that sort of thing. I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's really great to teach someone some of those skills and to see the pennies drop and have them feel more empowered to talk about their own businesses and to talk about the investment choices they're making within their own farms and express their confidence in that in sort of perhaps more professional language to bank managers and accountants.
It's interesting because I think there's two parts to this whole story. One is understanding how money works. In other words, budget. So you've got so much money. How do you earn more money? How do you cut your costs? Dealing with saving first, but then there's the whole investing side, so the business side, the business of growing wealth. And I think a lot of families are taught how to save. I know as a kid I was taught how to save really well, and my mum will be listening to this as my number one fan, but we didn't have the skills to know how to invest that money or grow that money. And I think that seems to be a big gap as well in the education process for children. But I like the point you made before is we used to see in the past that families would actually spend a whole lot of time putting their kids through what I'd like to call an apprenticeship phase, where they learn to drive the tractor, learn to muster the cattle, drive the truck, plant the crops. But seldom do they ever go through the business side of things until they're a lot older, and it doesn't become ingrained in them. And I think teaching kids about money and investing and those sorts of things at an early age is like the foundation to the next step, which is the more complicated stuff.
Yes, certainly. And we have to acknowledge that in a generation, farm businesses have changed quite significantly. And the challenges that were perhaps facing farm businesses a couple of decades ago aren't the challenges that are facing them now. And you tend to then be conditioned by the environment that your parents grew up in, perhaps rather than the environment that you're doing now. So I've met a lot of farmers that are certainly particularly risk averse, and this was drummed into them by parents who had to live through situations where interest rates were 18%, where the capital gain on land was very, very low. So the idea of borrowing money to expand for them seemed to be a step too far, because all of their financial education was based around the specific situation that their parents had to deal with and probably dealt with very well in the context of where they were at that time. So now they're trying to apply knowledge that perhaps was applicable in the 80s to 2020 or 2022 or 2023, and we're facing different challenges. So when we're talking about financial education with kids, I think it's really important to say, look, this is a situation that we're in now. Economically, this is a situation our grandparents were in. You're going to be in a different situation, and you're going to have to learn these concepts but adapt them to where you're at that particular time. Farm businesses have also got a lot bigger. So they're now handling more assets. So the net assets figure, that bottom line figure, is a lot bigger. And the farm businesses tend to be a bit bigger. So larger land areas, more likely to be employing staff, all of those sorts of things. So again, the skills are a little bit different. The businesses are a lot more complex than they perhaps once were.
Yeah, it's now the business of farming. It's not farming, is it?
Certainly, it's not. And I think a lot of people are attracted to those lifestyle aspects of farming, but in reality, you might be able to achieve the same lifestyle on 20 acres, half an hour out of West Wyalong quite easily. Might be a little bit harder to actually achieve those sorts of lifestyles when you're trying to do the work of two people on farm and there's not enough time to do all the other sorts of things. So you've got to be really conscious of that too, carving back that lifestyle out of your business to the extent you can.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Okay, so now in the first two parts of this series, I talked with a mate of mine, Tim, and we've both got nieces and nephews and also got daughters around the same age. My daughter's 6, his is, I think, about to turn. And so what we're going to talk today is about kids that are a little bit older and how we start this process. And you've got a strong education background, teaching people, I suppose you'd say, plus also you've got the accounting knowledge. So let's just start with, how do you think you should go about, or how are you going about educating your kids now?
Well, look, I think any education about money with kids has really got to go back to your own family values and their own sense of self-worth, because I think one thing that we're really conscious of with kids is overconsumption. So not wanting to raise people that need the newest and greatest things, that have to be driving around in flash cars all the time, that are really overly influenced by social media and have to get their nails and hair done every month and everything's got to look, 100% all the time. The way we insulate them from that is to give them a really good sense of self. And that's things that all the parents, I think, listening to this podcast would be trying to do anyway, affirming their own individual value, loving them, looking after them, spending time with them. And if we can do that, they're less likely to think that they need possessions to make up for some sort of gap. They're less likely to think they're going to be judged on what they are outwardly looking rather than who they are as a person. So we can emulate that and model that to our kids by not, pointing out the person with all the flash stuff and saying, oh, well, I wish I was them, or wow, isn't that fantastic? Like looking and highlighting those people that live our values and that live the way we want to live, and saying, oh, look, I really admire that person because of the work they do in the community, or because they always turn up early for footy, because they work hard, because they take time off for holidays to spend with their families, so we're just sort of highlighting those things rather than highlighting those superficial symbols of wealth, I suppose. So that's the foundation, that really good sense of self. And then we can build on that with some of that more technical sorts of monetary knowledge. So they're really simple concepts to start with, income minus expenses equals profit. So in a business sense, we can understand that. We can talk about little concepts like fixed expenses versus variable expenses, or fixed costs versus variable costs. So, as we produce more, some things are going to cost us more. We need more drench for our sheep. We need more fertilizer for our crops. But some things like our electricity bill, like the running cost on our ute, are, fairly standard across the year. One of the other things that it's really great to get across to teenagers particularly is that saving is just delayed spending. So everyone finds a bit of pleasure, or most of us find a bit of pleasure in spending money and doing things with it and getting that. And teenagers often fall into the trap of going, oh, well, look, if I save it, then I won't get to spend it and I won't get to have that feeling. But you do. It's important to know that saving is just delayed spending. And I think in teenagers, really good to not set that time goal too far in the future. So it's really hard for teenagers to conceptualize what they're going to be or how they're going to feel in 5 or 6 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time is just too far ahead. So it might be about that sort of 2 to 3 year time frame. In 2 to 3 years' time, would you like to be able to buy a car because you'll get your L's then? Or would you like to be able to buy a motorbike? So having those goals not too far away. So yes, there's some fantastic things you can show them, and I wouldn't say not to do it, but, compounding investments and saying, okay, if you put some money away now, this is how much money you're going to have at 60. Your typical 13 or 14-year-old cannot think that far ahead.
Well, a 25-year-old wouldn't.
No. So I think it's about putting that time frame into something that's probably a little bit more relatable for kids, and then showing them those peers that have done well in that sense in terms of financially setting themselves up, that have perhaps gone off to buy a house or, assisted in paying their university education or saved money up for travel. So saving up money for travel is a really one that sparks a lot of joy in kids. If you can put some money together now, you really can't go far from home at the moment, but in a couple of years' time, you'll be able to travel overseas and you'll have a lot of freedom. And aligning that sort of thing with the freedom that they'll have in the future. So yes, saving is just delayed spending.
I think that's an important point. I think anything that's outside of the next week or so, most kids can't even conceptually grasp that totally, and there's no motivation. And society now is driven around this, I have to have everything now. We have a complete lack in many cases of delayed gratification. It just doesn't seem to be part of the culture as much anymore. And I think for me with Sophie, that's what I'm really focusing on trying to do, is trying to teach her delayed gratification through various things. And with a 6-year-old, that's awful tough.
Oh.
Yeah, but we went back, and Tim and I talked about in the second episode was talking about the jelly bean experiment and teaching kids how to delay that gratification as well. So
they're so funny. But you see those things online, the jelly bean. I've seen a few with marshmallows. You have one marshmallow if you eat it now. If you can wait 5 minutes, you get 2. Children, even at that sort of 2, 3, 4, they haven't been instructed, but they have a natural predisposition. So some children are going to want the prize straight away. And it's not a character flaw, it's a personality difference. So it's really good for people to recognize that even if they teach their children all of these things, some kids are going to pick it up really quickly. Some are going to have to learn it the hard way. But most kids turn out really well as adults most of the time. So don't get too hung up in thinking that, they can't work it out now. They blow all their pocket money every week. They blow up their motorbike. They're not going to turn out all right. They will turn out all right. It's just about quietly persisting with the messages that you're going to get across and living them yourself, I think. Saying, look, we're contemplating buying a new car because this one's just at the end of its life, and taking them through that journey with you. We could get this or we could get that. And what is, if we choose this, what are we giving away? So that concept of opportunity cost, which I didn't hit until I was at university, but it's a really pretty simple thing to understand. If you make one decision, it often rules out another decision. So if you spend $100,000 on a car instead of spending $20,000 a car, you've got $80,000 there that could have been spent on something else. It rules you out of perhaps investing, perhaps doing some other work that you want to do, making some savings choices, going on a holiday. So putting those choices in front of kids is really important. Lots of families work on the idea of financial knowledge with the illusion of scarcity. Now, a couple of generations ago, we didn't have to have an illusion of scarcity. We didn't have to tell our kids we've got no money because we didn't have any money. And it was pretty easy to say, well, sorry, we can't afford that. I think for smaller, domestic day-to-day purchases, it's pretty hard to say you can't have a Magnum, you've got to have an icy pole, because you do realistically have enough money to buy a Magnum. So I think it's about pointing out the opportunity cost. So rather than saying we don't have any money, it's about saying, if we purchase that, then we won't be able to purchase this. If we purchase that, then we won't be able to save this. If we invest in this now, we will have the opportunity to do something else later on.
I think that's important. I've been trying that with Sophie, my daughter, and not having any siblings. She's an only child, and that makes it a little bit hard because they don't see the other children, the interactions, and the other things children are doing. But that trying to come up with a trade-off for all your choices we've been working through, and one of those is I've been practicing letting go because I very much want to teach her, so I'm very hands-on. My wife says sometimes controlling, in the sense that I want to control. You can't make mistakes, kid. I'm teaching you this so you don't. And she gets so frustrated with me because she's quite a smart kid and I know I'm doing the wrong thing, but she's got this thing with stuffed toys. She loves animals. So whenever she saves her pocket money up, we go down to the cheap shop and she buys another stuffed toy, and she's got this bloody box full of stuffed toys, and it drives me insane every time I see it. And my wife says to me, look, man, you just got to let her go through this. We have the conversations about the fact that she plays with it, and then 3 days later she's forgotten about that toy and that she could have bought something else, or she could have gone and got an ice cream, or all these sorts of things. And I think the lesson I've personally learned over this journey so far is that sometimes you've just got to let them make their own mistakes and then just slowly infuse the lessons, and hopefully that takes root and grows into some wisdom.
No, it'll probably grow into the other end where it's, perpetually buying new gear for the horse, or new parts for the motorbike, or new bars for the motorbike, or all of these other sorts of things. It continues to happen and they continue to have to learn their own lesson. I think one thing that kids can find really hard when they like doing those, so one thing that's really fun to go through with them is actually adding up the total costs they've spent on that and then comparing it to another item. So, 10 Furbies or whatever else at $15 each is $150, and that's a lot of money. So that can be really interesting. The other way is bargain hunting for those sorts of things. So my son was dead set when he was probably 6 or 7 at wanting a Mars bar, and he wanted to get it from the servo, and it's like $3.50 from the servo. So I sent him down the street in West Wyalong to find the cheapest Mars bar he could, and he really enjoyed that exercise of going, then to the takeaway shop where they were marginally cheaper, and then to the supermarket where they're a bit cheaper, and then to find the ones that were internationally labelled at the Golo shop and buy those ones for probably about 80 cents a bar. So those things can really be really, really good fun. But yeah, you do have to let them fail. And in the scheme of things, they're not big things. They're not big decisions. They're not big amounts of money. And they'd recognise, and they do grow out of it. Part of it's a maturity thing too, So the other things, the other concept that sits behind that is the concept of utility. So that's saying how much joy or how much value or how much does this thing bring to me? So this Furby or this muffler or this, new bridle, how much pleasure does that give to me, and how am I going to feel about it now, and how will I feel about it in 2 weeks, and how will I feel about it in 3 weeks? So not about, self-flagellation and regret, but actually just adding things up and saying, well, this brings me a little bit of joy now, but in 3 or 4 months' time, I'm not going to feel as good about it. How much this progressive, building of something else, how much joy is that going to give? And also giving them that joy that comes from saving or investing. So perhaps not at that 4, 6-year-old, but, sitting back with the 12, 14, 16-year-old and saying, that's how much savings you had at the beginning of the year. This is how much savings you've got now. Take pleasure in that. You've done really, really well. So that aspect of it also gives them some sense of pride and some sense of joy and a feeling of utility as well.
Because you don't want to always be telling them that they're wrong all the time. I think they've got to learn their own sense of self and learn the lessons and go through. What about paying kids to do things? So my wife and I have come at this slightly differently, and we've landed in the middle where in our household we generally compromise, and it's what my wife wants to do.
You're a happy man,
I'm a great
Ben.
husband for that. We always joke about that. But how do you feel with your kids about paying them to do things versus, say, family? It's just part of the family contribution. Because when I grew up on the farm, we were never paid for farm work. There was other benefits we got, but we were never actually paid for that. How do you feel families should be thinking about that, whether they're in business and their kids are coming to work in the family business, or doing things around home if they don't have a business, or on farm? What are your thoughts around that?
What sort of age group are you talking about, Ben? Because I think it varies.
Look, yeah, let's say, from 10 and above.
10 and above. Okay, from 10 and above, I really think those minor things, minor household tasks, which are you looking after yourself, should cease to be paid for. So there should be no financial incentive for making your own bed, for unpacking the dishwasher once or twice a week, for taking out the rubbish. So those day-to-day, we are a member of household and we contribute to that, we should stop paying for those as parents, generally speaking. Under 10, fine. It's a great incentive. It's a great way to introduce that work relationship. And really most, 6 or 7-year-olds can't do much of any real monetary value for the family. Whereas 10 and up, we can then go on for things that perhaps in some households would be outsourced if they weren't done by kids. So, mowing the lawn, washing cars, all of those things that would perhaps come at the cost to the family if they weren't paying kids to do it. If you've got your own family business, whether it's a farm or something else, I really do think it's appropriate to pay kids for their contribution. One is the difference between the effort that siblings tend to put in. And the smaller the family, perhaps this is less of a concern. But you do find when you've got more kids, when you've got a range of ages, that they do contribute in different ways and they do contribute in different numbers of hours. So it's great to work out a fairly basic hourly rate and then just pay them for the effort that they put in. And our kids keep a little timesheet where they just write down how many hours that they've done. We have a bit of a policy on what gets paid and what doesn't. So if they're just going down to Nan's to pick up a ute and bring it back, that's not paid work. But if they're doing a couple of hours of sheep work, if they're doing a major paddock shift as part of sowing or harvest and there's hours of work there, that's certainly, we pay for that. But you have to work at feeding dogs, that might not be something that you pay for. Feeding your own horse, obviously, that's not something you pay for. But those hourly rates are really, really good. It just aligns that whole thing about value of your own effort, and the more effort you put in, the more money you get. Now, some family businesses, and I dealt with a lot through the drought, certainly found that was a bit hard to find the cash to do that. So in that circumstance, there's a couple of recommendations. One is winding back what you pay for, and it's a pretty simple transaction. So you say, okay, well, look, across, this is something you work out in your head. You're going, okay, look, across this year, they've earned $2,000 or $3,000. Now they're needing a new laptop for school. That might be something that they either make a contribution to or pay for. They pay for their own phones, they pay for their own phone bill. So these are some things in some families that are paid for by parents. In families where they're paying their children, they might decide to step back those things that they actually pay for. And, theoretically, the kids value it more when they pay for it.
Absolutely.
And you tend to see that, maybe I don't want it so much, or maybe I'm not prepared to pay so much for it. So my son, when he was in year 8, got a phone for the first time, and I said, look, he said, what are you going to pay? And I said, well, look, I'm not adding to my fixed costs, Joe. So you can pay the monthly fee. We found a great $15 plan with Aldi, which met the mark, $15 a month. I said, we'll buy a second-hand phone. He said, well, are you prepared to chip in? I said, yes, I'm prepared to chip in $250. And they were looked a bit online, and they were running about the $500 mark, and I thought that was half, and I thought that was fair. And talk about delayed gratification. He'd been begging for this phone for about 3 or 4 years. He waited about 3 weeks until he found one for $260, Ben.
That's a beautiful lesson, isn't
it? Yeah. And it was just this whole thing about this kid that wanted everything now. When it came down to spending his own money, he was prepared, to wait until he could find one cheaply and to wait for that then to arrive. If I had offered to pay for the whole thing, I think he'd march me into the car and make me drive down to Wagga to buy a brand new one. But when it was his money, different story. So, yeah.
But that's part of the managing money. And I heard a great story from a mate recently. I don't know all the details of it, but it was essentially people that were on a cattle station up in northern Queensland, and they paid their kids very well, for any work they did on the farm. And then when they went into town and they had to buy clothes and they wanted to buy shoes and bags for school and laptops and phones, they had to pay for everything.
Yeah.
So it was like, we'll pay you. You live here rent-free, all that sort of stuff, but you need to cover everything outside of here. And they said those kids learned to manage money really quickly, and it was amazing how it went from I want to I'm not willing to spend that money on that, or I can buy a mobile phone for $500, not $1,000. I'm going to buy the cheaper one.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is the right answer in any way, shape, or form. And some kids, I'm assuming that'll work, and others not. But I thought that was a great way of kids understanding how to manage the money, because I think that's the skill. It's the management, and making that part of the family values, as you mentioned to start with, I think is really, really important. And I mentioned again in, I think it was the first episode, is the Jewish community is, I didn't realize this till a couple of years ago, that one of their real strong family or religious values is the ability to manage their money well. And it becomes one of their key things. And so they instill that in their children, and it's all part of the learning process that they then teach it to their children. And it's been working for thousands of years for them. And I think these are the types of lessons that they would be teaching their kids, is how to manage your own money. And then also setting the expectations of the why you need to do this. So you're learning this lesson with your phone because as you get older and the transactions get bigger, and you then see how many hours you've got to do to buy that new car or that new motorbike, etc., it really starts to become tangible.
It certainly does. It certainly does. So the other thing that you can do if there's not a lot of cash around is certainly borrow money back from your kids. And this was one of the things that came up in some of our cash flow budgeting workshops is that, you know, you've got your kids, they've managed to put away some thousands of dollars in their bank accounts, and it's perfectly okay to say, look, things are a bit this tight this month because we haven't been able to sell these wieners, or we're looking to go for a family holiday and there's sort of not a lot of free cash to do that until the harvest money comes in. Can I borrow some money from your bank account? And if we all of the kids put in, you know, $1,000 each in their bank account, then we've got $5,000 that we can do something with as a family, and we'll pay you back when the cash flow of the family business improves. So that gives them some really worthwhile lessons. It gives them an enormous sense of self. So, you know, I am contributing to this business and I am part of, a collective family responsibility. It's a way of seeing money as something that is to a degree shared between family members. You know, it can move backwards and forwards. And I certainly want my children looking, if they, you know, and they may well hit hard times, looking to their siblings first rather than nimble for a quick money loan. Do you know, I'd much rather than pick up the phone and say, look, we've had a couple of rough weeks and, you know, someone's lost their job and we'll be back on track soon enough. But, you know, can you spot me some money for a short period of time? So I want them doing that, and that gives them the lesson for that. And it also shows them the volatility of business and how, you know, if you're prepared to make that life choice, then you've got to accept the fact that things won't always work out as you plan. And things might...
Doesn't matter what life choice you make, though, Carmen.
True enough.
I mean, if you're a mechanic, you could lose your job. If you're an accountant, you could lose your job, or someone gets sick in the family, and it builds a level of resilience to understand that these adverse events that happen, you have to learn how to deal with them. And I think so many of our kids these days are sheltered from any difficulty or uncertainty. And so then when they actually do hit true adversity, they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah. Or they reach some slight minor adversity and they think it's true adversity is the flip side of things.
Of course, yeah. And that's the major problem with my daughter is she's an only child. We'd love to have had more, but because we got the one through IVF, and she doesn't want, in essence, for anything, like in the sense that both my wife and I have we've worked hard to set ourselves up financially. So it's not like when we were kids on the farm when we'd hit droughts and interest rates were 20%. And it's this whole, well, how do we manufacture in some way, shape or form some adversity so she has to learn? Because I'd rather her learn on small adversity than on big. And it's interesting you say that. I like that one actually, Carmen, because I remember having a client years ago that were in the cotton industry, and they had some severe family problems when they went through a significant drought, that the son, and in this case, daughter-in-law, and then also the daughter and their son-in-law couldn't understand the concept that they had a big farming operation. And when the drought was on, mum and dad said, we're not paying for holidays. We've got to buckle down. We're not spending any money on the houses. There's no new cars. Everything just has to be shut down. And it caused so much family division because the kids are going, well, you know, and I'm not talking about 15-year-old kids, I'm talking 35-year-old kids, were just mortified that their lifestyle would be impacted. And it was because they'd never had to share. They'd been sheltered from any difficulty in the past. And mum and dad were lovely people and tried hard, but they just said, I can't believe that this is what we're dealing with when they're 30 to 35, this inability to understand the concept of pull your belt in and deal with that concept. So I do like that. I think that's probably a great idea for some people.
Yeah, it can work. It's just, moving again from that model of teaching children about money from this perception, illusion or reality of scarcity to developing another model of teaching about finance, which perhaps suits a family, which hopefully intergenerationally over the next couple of generations is going to be in a much better position.
So that's a really important point, because I think we're absolutely seeing the outcome of the old 2 generations to make it and 1 to lose it. And kids these days have gone through an absolute, Goldilocks time of low interest rates. All investment assets have got up. They've never had to worry about getting a job. We're set up for a generation to go through now and actually be worse off than their parents. And the stats are starting to come through showing that. And I was reading something out of America recently that essentially in wealthy families, and I don't know how they define wealthy, I'm guessing it's over a couple of $1 million of assets, but they said 90% of wealth is lost within 2 to 3 generations from the first person building it, which is absolutely frightening to think that wealth could be built and amassed and then it gets lost. And I think something like 40% of the reason was something like miscommunication amongst family members and not teaching them. But the vast majority, it was not preparing the heirs to be able to take over responsibility of managing that asset. And farmers and graziers and business owners are in a real risk of not preparing their kids to be able to manage this asset or manage this family wealth going forward. So I think that's a really important point. Now, what about, Carmen, we talked about this the other day briefly before we started, but what about the concept of involving the kids in the farming business? Because I know some families are really confidential. They don't want their kids to see what's in the bank because, they might get lazy or they might get freaked out because there's a certain amount of debt. What are your thoughts about involving them?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. I think it's really good. And one of the things I was going to mention when we talked about paying kids is the other option is their own little micro business within the bigger business. So they might, kids have bagged up manure or raised potty calves or raised potty sheep or had their own little, small commercial flock of a different breed on the existing farm. So that there's a lot of options around that, which are fantastic. In those cases, you'd really want them to be providing predominantly entirely their own labour and covering the variable costs associated with the farm. So that's good to sit down, even if it's just with a piece of paper and a pen, ideally a spreadsheet, let them tally up the costs associated with their enterprise to actually ascertain how much profit they're making. So it's a really great learning exercise to introduce some of those words, terms, concepts. The other thing is just slowly opening the door to the understanding of their own business. And you can go about these things the right way or the wrong way, Ben. I had one child of mine, I'm certainly not perfect at any of this motherhood or finance stuff, but one child was nagging me about something or another, and there was a massive fertiliser bill sitting on the bench. And I said, have a look at that. I'm not buying these things for you. And he came back to me a couple of days later and said, look, Mum, I really think we should sell the farm. If we've got bills coming in like that, I really think we should sell the farm. And I'd made a big mistake. I'd made him feel really insecure about our financial position just to teach him a cheap lesson about, not wanting to buy an Xbox. I think that was a mistake, and I really certainly don't think you should go about things like that. As kids get to that sort of 14, 15, 16 age group, I really think it's great to start opening up the discussions about the financial situation that the business might be in. An easy way to do that is to start talking about those variable cost sorts of things. So looking at whatever your production enterprise is, with pigs or chickens or what goes into making a ton of your output, what input costs are involved. Then start talking about the overhead costs, and then talking about, what's left over and where does that have to go to debt repayment? Does it have to go to saving up for new machinery? Where does that money go? So talking to them about those sorts of things. One of the subjects I taught in university was an agribusiness planning subject, where probably about 3/4 of the students were looking at doing a major assignment on their own family farms. And some, to that point in the early 20s, had never ever seen any numbers about their own businesses. And some were all over it, had seen it, were familiar with it, had gone to meetings with the bank manager, had gone to meetings with the accountant, and really knew where they were. Those ones were generally quite empowered. And whatever the situation, they was, quite accepting of it, worked out where things were going to go from there. The ones had never seen it before were often quite shocked, and some of them shocked that, yes, the family was in a lot better position than they thought, as you'd alluded to, Ben, or shocked the other way, that there was a certain debt load there that they thought was, basically insurmountable. So one thing that it's really important to get, or two things, one thing to get your kids to have their heads around is, one is confidentiality. And the other one is just to get their heads around the size of the numbers, because some of the numbers are really, really big in farm businesses particularly.
But also, too, they don't have any concept. Like some of them just don't have concept. And because I remember a guy once it was 2001, and he had a meat exporting business, a guy I knew, and he had $10 million in debt back then. And that was monstrous. And I remember saying to him, how do you sleep at night? Because I got the concept of money, obviously. And yeah, he just said, it's just zeros, Ben. And so kids see those things. They don't necessarily get the concept, because once you get above $1,000 or a couple of thousand, they just don't get the concept. So it's being able to give them the concept of, is this normal? Is this abnormal?
Yes.
And this is how we manage those risks. Because I think that as you called it a mistake, and I've made plenty of those with Sophie, is the ability to go back and give them context around the comments as well, to be able to change the paradigm.
Yeah.
Because debt can be good. And I think, I was taught from a young age, because my parents went through the 80s when interest rates went to 20%. And I was always taught debt's bad debt, don't have debt. But I think debt is a good thing if used appropriately. And I wrote a column about debt's like a chainsaw. If used appropriately, it's a powerful tool. But if it gets out of control and you don't know what you're doing, you can lose an arm. And I think giving kids the ability to understand the concepts behind these numbers. And I think also vocabulary is really important. Normalizing the vocabulary, speaking about investing, profit, dividends, structures and entities, estate planning, intergenerational succession planning, like giving them the vocabulary to understand and have the conversation. And I used to get a lot of clients who bring their kids into the financial advice, not everyone, but bring them into the financial advice discussions. And it was amazing how much the kids picked up. And because I love helping families and kids, I'd involve the kids in and explain things to them. But it was great to give them that vocabulary to go out and feel more confident, because with the ability to have those discussions breeds confidence in the kids. And you said something really cool the other day when we spoke, was about, don't eyeball a kid and lecture them, catch them during everyday tasks.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned the car, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, it's easy. You listen to this podcast and you're on your own and you think, right, now my kid's 15, I've got to sit down, I've got to talk to them about all of this sort of stuff, and I'm going to work through this list of things that Ben and Carmen talked about. Most teenagers are really averse to that. So one thing you're doing, Ben, is actually providing that role as a financial educator for your nieces and nephews, and that's fantastic. If you've got someone within your network that's prepared to perhaps only have 1, 2 or 3 conversations with your kids over their teenage years about finance and about money, great. They're actually going to listen a lot more to someone outside of the family than they are perhaps to you.
There is a little bit of eye rolling when Uncle Benny sits them down and says, righto, kids, today we're going to talk about shares or something like that.
Ben,
there's definitely eye rolling.
But they sit down. And if it was their parents, they'd walk out the door or they'd pick up their phone or whatever else. So, as an uncle, you're certainly perhaps a step ahead. So if they're rolling their eyes at you, you can imagine what they're doing when they're talking to their parents about the same thing.
Yeah, and I don't take any rubbish. I'm like, sit down, do what you're told. Uncle Benny's speaking.
It's really good. So what we can do is just look for those opportunities. Now, it's great to talk to people in the car. You're not eyeballing them. You're traveling in the same direction. So I think that momentum it's a bit of positivity. We're going the same way. They're locked in. They can't go away. So it's a great environment to have any serious discussions with kids, with spouses, with business partners. You're on the tractor, you're in the car. Use that as an opportunity. Have things lying around the house that spark that sort of conversation. So maybe not your massive fertilizer bill, but perhaps it's a newspaper, perhaps it's a finance magazine that you perhaps, pick up and think, oh, I know all this, I'm not be bothered reading it, but have it lying around. Your kids might pick it up. You might point out an article that you're particularly interested in. They might have a read of it. So there's lots of those sorts of publications available. And, they're fairly, like Ben, you'd pick them up and think, oh, this is fairly generic stuff. I've heard it all before. But you've got to think back to where these people are at on their financial education journey, and they can be really, really useful.
They can. And I think that's a really important point, Carmen, is most people say to me, Ben, I want to hear about kids and money. That seems to be, if I talk about all the things I talk about and then I mention kids and money, everyone's ears prick up. And of course, it's a topic I love. But most of them say, look, I just don't know myself. Like, how can I teach my kids about money when I don't understand? And I always say to them, go on the journey together. And that's what the Barefoot Investor did really well, is he gave this concept for families to go on the journey and learn together. And if you do want to learn about investing in shares, we'll find out how to invest in shares and start reading and watching. I mean, YouTube now has some amazing stuff. Granted, there's a lot of scams and rubbish, but there's still some really interesting information that you can start to educate your kids and learn together. And I think that whole investing is a really important one, because once kids grasp it, kids love it, because it's essentially a game in many ways. It's gamified. It's like, how do we invest? What do we do? How do we go about it? You've just got to find a way, I've found, is to convert that from money, wealth, and finance speak to kids speak. And so with my nieces and nephews, they've got a little potty rearing business. So they get local orphan calves, feed them up, fatten them up, put them in Pa's feedlot, and then sell them. And then I start to teach them about shares and investing with using cattle as an example. You know, a share is like a cow, and every year the cow generally has a calf, and that's a calf. And then in shares, you have a shares, and you get a dividend coming in. And then some years the cow's worth more, some years the cow's worth less. That's the fluctuation in the value of the cow. The share could be the same. You could buy Commonwealth Bank shares for $100 a share. Next year it might be $80 a share, and vice versa. And when you find a way to really simplify it for them, they grasp onto it. And I remember my nieces and nephews, we've set up managed funds now for them. And every time I talk to them, I'm like, there's your dividend coming in. And I say, remember, that's the calf. And they go, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What are we doing with the calves or the dividends? I said, we're buying more cows. And they're like, wow, that's a great idea.
Yeah. And you know
and
what?
So
you don't have to get up early in the morning before school to feed them. How good is that? Unbelievable.
Absolutely. And yeah, so they love it. And I think that investing part is what a lot of people forget, because they do feel nervous that they don't know themselves. And the reality is kids don't need to have a university degree in investing to start understanding it. They just need to start to learn that vocabulary and understand how the mechanics and the absolute basic mechanics work.
And they just need to start off often with a bit of money to do it. You know, that tends to be then that discussion about where that comes from. Is that something that you're prepared to chip in for as a parent to get them started? And, you know, even though you might not be covering other disposable income and other costs, you know, it might be good to sort of put some money aside to get them started at that. But talk to them about the opportunity cost. You know, I could be putting this $1,000 towards our debt, towards my mortgage, towards a little holiday with my girlfriends. I'm going to give it to you for this purpose. And this is what I want to see you do with it.
Yeah, so the money comes with a responsibility. And that's what I'm trying to teach Sophie is we've invested some money for her long term and we're adding to it. And the idea is that she will get that later on, but she has to buy a house or a deposit on a house with that. It's not to be spent on cars or holidays or anything like that, but it will come with an absolute responsibility. And the responsibility is you need to be able to articulate what it is, how it works, and you must, when you get your first job, contribute to that always. So, you know, 20% of your salary is always going to go into this investment if you want to get it at the end. And so it's transitioning that here where I could be using this for something else, but I'm going to be giving this or loaning this to you, and this is your obligation. You must understand how it works. Now, watch this space, because I've got a super smart little girl that does whatever she wants to do quite often because she's strong-willed like a mother. But I'm hoping that will be part of the journey. And I'll watch this space in 10 years. I might have to eat my words, Carmen.
We might have to report back, Ben. I've got a few strong-willed ones amongst mine as well. And it's going to be a really interesting journey to see how they all come out at the end. But I really, I think it's just about those core values of your family, developing that really good sense of self so that little Sophie's not thinking that she needs a fantastic car to prove her worth, that she's not needing all of these other superficial things, and that you know, that your responsibility to the next generation is to provide a roof over their head, food on their table, and they're the first things that we need to tick off as individuals and as families, and we need to concentrate on doing that and recognizing the privilege that comes with all of these things, that other people aren't so lucky, that aren't so wealthy, and it, you know, as much as you might say, my family have worked really, really hard for generations to provide this, the child being born into that environment is purely luck. It is purely luck. So, you know, they've got to go along and then do the best with it that they possibly can.
Well, we're in the top 1% wealthiest people in the world, just being in Australia. So it's trying to get that concept. I agree. So look, we're about running out of time now, Carmen. This has been fantastic. I'd love to keep having this conversation. There's so much more I'd like to understand, but there's only a certain amount of time. So we might come back and have another conversation one day to further this discussion if people find it interesting. So where can people find more about you online, Carmen?
If you look up AgriFocus, so www.agrifocus.com.au, you'll find our website and information on our courses and what we have running and what's coming up over the next couple of weeks and months.
Perfect. And now my final question for you is, what's your definition of true wealth?
Ooh, look, we can go all soft, Ben, and talk about health and family and whatever else. But I think if we're on a financial podcast and we're talking wealth, I think it's choice. For me, wealth comes down to choice. And it's choosing between, a holiday and staying at home. It's choosing between a nice car and one that's not so nice. It's choosing between this school and that school. It's just choices that we face. It's the choice between having 5 children or having 1 or 2 or 3. So for me, I think it's really just about those choice decisions that give us that flexibility in life to, the choice between helping friends or family out when they need it becomes a choice then, not something that we can't do. So that's what it all comes down to for me, certainly.
Well, I couldn't agree more. As a financial advisor for 20 years, my common statement to people is plan for your retirement, your exit out of the business or the farming operation, so that when you get to the right age, you've got choice.
Yes.
And you want to have choices on, and that's the definition of financial security. And then if you choose to work till you're 100, if you choose to be very frugal, if you choose to want to travel, if you choose that you want to fly an airplane, whatever it is you might want to do, you have the choice to do it within reason. So I think that's beautiful. And I really appreciated this, Carmen. This is fantastic. It's given me some really good ideas, and I'm very sure that people have got a lot from it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me be a part of it, Ben. Much appreciated.
Now, that's the end of the Kids and Money series, which we've called Money Muscles. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to it, and I really enjoyed it so far. Now, if you enjoyed the series, let me know. Maybe reach out on Facebook or Instagram, or send me an email, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Now, as always, if you could help a bloke out and share the podcast with your family and friends, that would be absolutely amazing. And thanks for joining us again today, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.